RILCA talk on this webinar. The topic, understanding the methodology and method. May I introduce our speaker? As a Professor Dr. Mark Vicars. Following 24 years of working in education in several countries, with 15 of those in higher education, Mark has extensive international and multi-sector experience of teaching and learning, embodied, blended, and online, as well as the solid track record of team and curriculum leadership. He's highly experienced on teaching and learning in Australia, Asia, and the UK, generating international opportunities for collaborative partnerships focused on teaching research nexus. He has developed research affiliations and educational partnerships and deliver internationally and deliver educational workplace training and research. Mark's philosophy of praxis is underpinned by the principles of social justice, and he has proven success in leadership in tertiary educative context and has substantial experience in providing quality and innovative in learning. As a scholar, collaboratively in dynamic, creative environments throughout his career, Mark has produced an integrated body of work that has fundamentally been focused upon engaging with teacher learners through transformative student experience. He was a past recipient of the Australian Learning and Teaching Council citation for pedagogical approaches that motivate, inspire, and support socially disadvantaged and culturally diverse students to overcome barriers of learning and to attain success. He is past president of the Australian Association for Qualitative Research, AQR, and is founding member of the International Institute for Critical Pedagogy and Transformative Leadership. He's the lead editor of Quality Research Journal, and his 2023 published books are Encounters and Disruptions, Re-Narrating Higher Education, Teaching and Learning, Storying Pedagogy as Critical Practice in Rethinking Higher Education series, and Literacy in Australia, Pedagogies for Engagement, the 4th edition. Last but not the least, he is also adjunct professor in our master's and PhD program in language and intercultural communication, and we miss him dearly. So without further ado, please give a big round of applause to Mark.
Without further ado, Kenny, could you help me? Could you allow me to share my screen with you? Because it's currently disabled.
Right. Let me ask my staff. Could you allow Mark to share his screen, please?
Okay, so now I'm going to share my desktop.
All right.
Be able to see my screen, which is going to help enormously. I now need to just do something else so I can see people. Right, because inherently I'm very nosy, I like to see people, and I know that people don't always like to put their cameras on, but I do like to see people that I'm kind of talking to. So if you could put your cameras on so I can see you, that would be great. So you will see my screen. You are screen share. Can you all see my screen? Yeah. So the title of today's talk was Understanding the Difference Between Method and Methodology. And I use the word was in the past tense because I've renamed it. And I've renamed it Dealing with the Debris of Disciplinarity, because I was supposed to be with you in person at Mahidol University. But yesterday I encountered the disciplinarity of immigration at Melbourne Airport, who refused me to allow to board the plane because the data that I presented didn't meet their requirements, i.e. my passport had a little bit of Coca-Cola on one corner, so I was not allowed. So I thought this is a good analogy to think about what we do when we come to do research, because we have to deal with the disciplinarity of different paradigms, of different approaches, of different ways of thinking about what is truth. And we must not forget, as I was reminded yesterday, that research is a power-driven act. Research is never neutral. It's always contingent upon who is doing the research, who is asking the question. And that is kind of summed up in this slide, which always kind of makes me giggle a little bit, because it's like, you know, we're learning about the lived experience of people. And there are multiple ways in which we can kind of come to understand how we research lived experience. And if you have an elephant, which you do have in Thailand, you have lots of elephants, and you position people around the elephant in different places, and all these people are looking at that particular place, then they will come up with different interpretations of what an elephant is, depending on where they are situated and what they are looking at. So some might say it's a spear, some might say it's a tree, some might say it's a snake. And that brings us on to thinking about the following questions in terms of what paradigm are we going to use? Are we going to use a qualitative or quantitative paradigm? What is the methodology that we're kind of going to use? And I think it's, again, important to remember that we are all coming from somewhere. We are all situated somewhere. We all have a view about what is good research and what is bad research. So where we're coming from, or our positionality or our position, is significant, and it has to be brought into the process of thinking about methodology and methods. And in terms of the theoretical and analytical choices, there have been several, if not ongoing, research moments. So the traditional research moment started in the 1900s to the 1950s and was focused on the objective understanding of truth. Then we had the modernist age from 1950 to 1970. And then from 1970 onwards, we had the blurred genre. We had the mixing of methods and methodologies, which led to the paradigm wars in the 1980s, where the qualitative and quantitative researchers were arguing quite strongly for their positions. Then we had the crisis of representation, which followed in terms of, well, how do we come to represent our research on paper? Is language neutral? Can we ever be neutral? Is there such thing as objective knowledge? Or is knowledge always situated in some cultural, linguistic, and discursive system? So if I asked you now to close your eyes and think of nothing, you couldn't do it, because nothing in itself is a linguistic construction, and it's a symbolic act. So the crisis of representation talked about the very nature of the words that we speak, or as Paulo Freire, the father of critical pedagogy, said, the words that speak us. Wittgenstein also made the same comment when he said, language is the limits of our world. So the crisis of representation got us to think about the actual act of authoring research. Then we moved into the methodologically contested present, where there was much argumentation about what is methodology and what it could be. That was followed by the paradigm proliferation, which has kind of led us to the present fractured moment of post-humanism, which offers a critical inquiry into thinking about research with the more than human. And we need to think carefully about these different research moments because they inform us about what has come before, about those scholars that have opened the doors for us to do things differently. Because cultural studies of science have indicated to some extent, and some of you may disagree with me when I say this, that all scientific inquiry, and I use scientific in inverted commas, is jerry-rigged. We all know from our own research endeavors that science is not neat and clean as it is described in research books. It's not procedural. We don't start with A and then finish with X. There's a lot of coming and going. And maybe this admission that research is messy, that it's complicated, that it sometimes doesn't follow the rules, contradicts those who think that research is clean and linear and straightforward. And maybe those people would rather have us remain in our methodological closets. So here we have to think about the distinction between methodology and method. Yeah, so methodology thinks about the paradigm, thinks about the approach, thinks about the study design, thinks about the rationale and the value and why we're doing this research in the first place and how we're doing this research in the first place. What is our relationship to truth? Do we believe that truth is the same as fact? Because it's not. It's not the same as fact. We can go along the beach and pick up pebbles and put them in our pocket. That's the fact that there are pebbles on the beach waiting to be picked up and put into our pocket. But that's not the same as truth. Truth is not waiting to be picked up and put into our pockets. Truth is made, knowledge is made, and it's constructed by and through and out of the tools that we choose to look at. Now, the best analogy here is I have an eyeglass, and this eyeglass is a lens which brings things into focus or makes things not very focused. Methodology is a little bit like my eyeglass. It's a lens through which we choose to look at the world. And then we get on to methods. And the methods is the kind of data we collect. Now, I have a problem with that already because data, going back to my statement about language, is aligned with a positivist notion of research. So already as qualitative researchers, we are being colonized by a language of quantitative research, which is why I do not use the word data. Because data suggests there is something scientific, like that pebble waiting to be picked up and put into my pocket. Yes. So I don't use data. So when people ask me, well, what do you do if you don't do data? I usually answer with, I do the ephemera of everyday life. I'm interested in everyday life. And everyday life is not neat and clean and linear and procedural. It's messy and it's complicated and it's situated because knowledge is constructed in the interchange between the knower and the known. And how we come to know the known depends upon who we are. So here I am again, and I'm faced with the problematic of how to talk about methodology and method, because it always involves, I would argue, talking about social relations, talking about cultural models, talking about power and politics, talking about perspectives and experience and values and attitudes. When we go up to somebody, so I'm going to pick on Kenny here. When I go up to Kenny and I say to Kenny, hi, Kenny, I'm really interested in X, Y, and Z of your life. Why would Kenny want to tell me?
Because it's you, Mark. Because you are interesting.
But I'm asking you to tell me about the intimate details of your life. And you know me, but if I was
Because I
just...
trust you.
You trust me. So here we have something else, which is often not talking about methodology and method, which is trust. And the scientific quantitative people would say, what's trust got to do with it? Why is trust important? Because we're dealing with objective knowledge. So Kenny has just articulated, maybe consciously or unconsciously, his position in relation to what methodology is, because he's saying that trust is important. I, as those people that know me, often go around narrating the story of my life because I like to talk and I can talk under wet cement given half the opportunity. But a lot of people don't want to speak. So why should they tell you the most intimate details of their life? Because now was it, and Tarquin can correct me if I'm wrong, about 3 years ago, no, last year, it was last year, we had the Australian census. And I looked on the census form for the different kinds of data that they were collecting. Age, gender, married, divorced, how many children, occupation, etc., etc. And I thought, I've missed something. I've missed something on the data that they were looking to collect, because nowhere on that form was a box that I could tick indicating my sexuality. They were not asking me if they were assuming that I was a heterosexual man. Why is that important? Well, it's important because funding follows data. So the money follows certain groups, and being an absent presence on that census data meant that I didn't exist and that other people like me didn't exist. And therefore, if we don't exist, then services and money is not made available to us because we're a non-group. And that's why data is important. That's why we think about the kind of methods that we're using, be it interview or be it participant observation or ethnography, in terms of who is being let in and who is being deliberately left out. And it makes us think that knowledge is presupposed, especially within a quantitative paradigm, because a quantitative paradigm presents a hypothesis. It's what we call an a priori. Yeah, the sky is blue, the grass is green, and then we go out to test that hypothesis and would be very surprised if the sky turned green. But you know what? Sometimes it does. Sometimes if you're in Denmark or Sweden or Norway and you see the Aureola Borealis, you see the sky is green and red and orange and yellow. So again, it depends where you are. So your location is not a bounded site in research methodology. It's an itinerary. It's a map. It's a destination that might take you in a certain way. But let's go back to the positivists. Let's go back to the pebble on the beach, because the pebble on the beach prescribes to a hypothetico-deductive research design that says that there is such a thing as knowledge and it's waiting to be found. This systemized and scientific approach harkens back. It has a history. And that history starts with the mind, body, self, other split, which is often called the Cartesian dualism. And the Cartesian dualism assumes data, like my pebbles, exist out there somewhere in the real world to be found, collected, and coded. So I can go into Kenny's life and I can say to Kenny, Kenny, tell me the story of. And then as a researcher, I don't take much, I'm showing my age because normally people don't have pens anymore, but when I was doing it, we did have pens. I would say to Kenny, let me collect your precious voice and words on my telephone. And then I'm going to take them away. And I'm going to transcribe them. And I'm going to interpret them. And I'm going to code them. And I'm going to come up with what Kenny said is the whole point of research, which is to get new meaning. But I am making the meaning. Kenny might have meant something completely different. And this is what Patty Lather calls rape research. She talks about when we go into people's lives and we collect data and we take it away and we code it and we make a thematic analysis and then we write it up without ever sharing it back with the informants. The analogy is one of rape. We have gone into people's lives and we have taken something from them. We have taken their stories. And we have to be very careful with the stories that are being told to us, that we are listening accurately and that we can member check. So we need to give those stories back. We need to ask our informants whether those stories that we have told about their lives are truthful. And Kenny talked about trust. And trust is really important in getting truthful stories. And we talk about the similitude, the truthfulness, the trustworthiness of our research. So we think about the Cartesian dualism, which argued, or Descartes argued, that knowledge resides here. It resides in the mind. Knowledge is made in the mind. The body, let's forget about the body. It's got nothing to do with it. But if we think about this, this is not detached from the rest of me. The body carries my head. The body generates knowledge and emotions of itself. And so we need to think about what research we're doing, what research we're generating. So are we doing pure or basic research? Are we doing applied research? Are we doing practitioner research, which is often called action research or participatory research, where we have co-producers of knowledge, whether we're working with students or whether we're working in communities? It's participatory, we're collaborative. Or whether our research is aimed at transforming and making change, which is the last box, which is about critical, radical research, about research which is seeking to undo the taken for granted and given understandings of the world, to transform and make things better. So it's often research which can be also called social justice. And social justice research has very different methodologies than a scientist in a white coat or me going along to Kenny and saying, Kenny, can you tell me about your deepest fantasies? Kenny is not going to tell me about his deepest fantasies. It doesn't matter how much he trusts me. There are some things which are secret. But Kenny might think, well, here's Mark, a professor from a research institution, who's asking me to tell me questions. I really don't want to say no to Mark, because there we have the notion of power. So when I say to Kenny, Kenny, can you please tell me about your deepest fantasies? Kenny is saying, no way, no way. But what I'm going to do is I will tell him something, because he's asked me the question and I feel obliged. So what Kenny is telling me is actually an untruth. And that brings us to another question in methodology. How do we know what we are being told is truth or lies? So all of you at some point will have identified an issue that you may be interested in researching. You'd have thought, well, I'm interested in researching X, Y, and Z. And then you kind of think, well, how could I research this? Because there is never just one way. There are multiple methodologies, as I said, the different moments, the crisis of representation, the methodological paradigm proliferation. There are multiple ways in which we can start to think and look at our research issue. And the question is, what do you want to know about it? So let's go back to Kenny. Yeah. So I'm really interested in Kenny's deepest, darkest fantasies. I'm really interested in knowing what Kenny's fantasies are. But I need to ask the question, why do I want to know it? What are Kenny's fantasies going to tell me that is going to generate new knowledge in the world? Will it generate? It might generate new knowledge in the world. I don't know. But if I ask myself those questions, I have to give the answer, I can't do it. Because I'm being nosy. I'm being curious. It's not generating new research. It's just answering my own self-interest. And if I come up with the answers, then I can't do the research because there is no benefit. There is no gain to doing the research. So it gets back to the notion of doability. Is our research doable? Is our research ethical? Is what we want to find out in the greater good? Or is it just because, like Mark, is really curious and he wants to know about what Kenny thinks deep down about certain issues, which really is none of my business. And I have no right to ask him such things. So we go back then, or we come to rather the notion of quality. And we've already talked about paradigms. We've already talked about ways of thinking about research, which are quantitative, which are scientific, which is objective, that everything is neutral and that it can be measured, it can be collected, it can be coded, it can be analyzed. Or we think about research which is qualitative. And qualitative research is much messier because it's naturalistic. And by that, I mean it happens in the everyday. So if you're walking down the street and you are trying to make meaning from walking down the street, it depends what street you're walking down, what time of the day or night you're walking down the street, who you are walking down the street. Now, you may think that sounds a very peculiar notion of to say who you are walking down the street, but it brings in the importance in methodology and in method of positionality. I can walk down the street in many ways. I can walk down the street unobtrusively, but I can also walk down the streets by enacting out my identity. And so when people, again, and I go back, people ask me, what do you do as a researcher? I say, well, mainly what I do is I tell stories because I think stories can illustrate the complexity of everyday life. So I'm going to tell you a little story now. When I first moved to Melbourne, I did a lot of research because I wanted to live in a part of the city that was artistic, that was bohemian, that was gay friendly. That was very important to me. So I found from my research that the place that I should live was a suburb called St Kilda, because every year St Kilda had a gay pride march. So I thought, right, I will find a house in St Kilda. That's where I belong. And I wrote on my calendar the date of Gay Pride March. Now, I'm going to fast forward. There's me when I was a lot younger at the Gay Pride March. Yeah. However, the week before that photograph was taken, I looked at my calendar and my calendar said Gay Pride March. So at that point, my little dog, Tallulah, Sparkles, I'd gone out and bought her a pair of pink wings. And I put the pink wings on her. And then I dressed up. So I got my wig and I got my hat and I got all my clothes. And I started walking down the main street. to join the parade. And I thought, people are looking at me very strangely. Why are they looking at me very strangely? It's gay pride. And it was a really long street that I was walking down. So halfway down the street, someone said to me, "Excuse me, mate." And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Are you here for Pride?" I said, "Yes. Yes, I am here for Pride." They said, "You've got the wrong week, mate. It's next week." And there I was, stood in the middle of the street in a wig, with a dog wearing pink wings, thinking, now what do I do? And I thought the only thing you can do is run. And I hadn't run since 1982 because I decided it was something I didn't like and I wasn't very good at. And that if I was running, you'd better run too, because it meant I'm being chased by something horrible. But I ran. I ran all the way back down that street, all the way down the next street, all the way home. Tallulah, my little dog, couldn't keep, I was dragging her by the end because I shouldn't have been there on that street on that day in a wig with the dog wearing pink wings, because how I was looked at and received was dependent upon time and place. And it's the same with methodology, and it's the same with methods. How you look at the world goes back to who you are in the world. And who you are in the world and how your understanding of how the world works is your positionality. It's what we call ontology. So in qualitative and quantitative research, in quantitative research, ontology is not important. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter about your life experiences or what you bring, because you're testing a hypothesis that a priori, is the sky blue? Is the grass green? Doesn't matter that Kenny likes to dress up as a teddy bear. That's not important. Yeah. We just want to know whether the grass is green and whether Kenny has got the right tools to tell us if the grass is green. So we're setting out to prove or disprove something. In qualitative research, however, it does matter who you are. And so your ontology, your being in the world, your gender, your sexuality, your race, your culture, your language, all become important facets of the methodological research process, because they have already positioned you in relation to this thing called truth. And let's remember, truth and fact are not the same. The fact that I can go along the beach and pick up a pebble is undisputable. The truth of my encounter with that pebble is something different. And here we kind of get into different approaches, one of which is phenomenology. So I'm going to pick on Kenny again because he's my friend. Are you my friend, Kenny? Yeah. So I'm going to take Kenny and I'm going to drop Kenny in the middle of a wood. And in that wood, a tree is falling. Kenny, can you describe that tree falling to me, please?
A tree?
The tree, you're in the wood, I've just dropped you there. A tree is falling down. Can you describe the tree falling down, please?
A big pine tree was falling toward me. And I was running.
And what sound did it make?
Wow. That's interesting because I haven't heard a sour tree falling actually.
Okay, so just think about a tree falling. What sound does a tree
Bang,
make?
a bang.
Okay, okay. Um, And was there much damage to the tree when it fell?
Yeah.
What was damaged?
The trunk, the leaves, branches, twigs, and everything.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. You don't know that it made a bang because you don't know what kind of tree it was. You don't know if it was a big tree, or you said it was a big tree. You don't know if it was in a forest in England or a forest in Asia, or whether it was in a jungle. So context becomes really important in terms of methodology, because when we do qualitative work, we're constantly in interpretation. We're in interpretation and we're in search of interpretation. Now, if we think about a quantitative paradigm where we've gone out and we've got our premise that the sky is blue and we've tested it and we've come back and we've written it up and it's fact, it's data. Yeah. So our analysis starts at the end. In qualitative research, it's different. Analysis is not something which is added on to the end. Analysis, go back to my experience of walking down the street, starts with the process of data collection. As soon as you are immersed in inquiry, you're already thinking about possible interpretations. So analysis becomes part of the methodological frame. And we can think about different, I don't know whether you can see it very well. Maybe if I put my screen up bigger. If you can see here that what I've listed for you is different paradigms. So the positive paradigm, as I said, there are hidden rules. The epistemology is reliable. The question is what works. So when we're kind of engaged in different paradigms, then we have our ontology also shifts and also changes. So my work is mainly involved within the critical and the pragmatic. I'm interested in the rules and inequalities and injustices. So a lot of my work has been focused around LGBTQI lives. It's also been focused around lives that have been touched by poverty, or lives that have been touched by disability, or lives that have been touched by trauma. And therefore my work is therefore positioned at speaking a truth back to power. And my thinking is, how can I change this situation? How can I make it better? So I'm consciously positioned. I have an ideology which is against hegemonic power, which seeks to oppress. I'm against patriarchy. I'm against heteronormativity. I'm against racism. I'm against misogyny. I'm against abuse of all kinds. And that's what informs my research. So let's go on to the next page. So here we have again this notion of the difference between the two paradigms. One seeks to make generalized findings, which is the a priori quantitative approach. The other one, the qualitative research, is interested in what an anthropologist called Clifford Geertz has called rich, thick descriptions. So here we have Kenny, and I'm going to go back to Kenny. Yeah. So I'm going to place Kenny back into my forest. And I now want Kenny to give me some thick, rich description of the forest where the tree has fallen.
And there are a lot of tall trees surrounding me with different bushes. The environment in that forest is
Kind of bushes? What kind of bushes, Kenny? Are
oh
there
gosh.
big bushes or are they thin bushes? How many leaves are on each bush?
Oh my God, I haven't been to the forest for a long time. Gosh. Uh the green, thick bushes
Is there a
with a lot.
pathway you can walk, or do you have to fight your way through the bushes?
No, actually I could walk. I think I could walk along. But the way I walk it's quite muddy in
Ah,
that forest. Yeah,
okay.
with lots of insects and
Ah, okay.
a bit of sounds of the unfamiliar familiar sounds from animal sounds
What
and
animal sounds can you hear?
oh maybe a boar, wild boar, or
Okay,
a
so we get the
tigers.
idea that what Kenny is doing is building up rich, thick description. And that thick, rich description gives Kenny's account, gives Kenny's narrative a verisimilitude. It gives it a truthfulness because Kenny is locating his observations in relation to place, space, and context. Yeah, does that make sense? And then we kind of think, why is that important? Because it's important because we need to make sure that our research is quality. Because let me pick on somebody else. I could go to Sasiporn and I could say to Sasiporn and Sasiporn saying, oh my God, no, don't pick on me. I could say to Sasiporn, tell me a little bit about your research, Sasiporn. Sasiporn, in fact, I'll ask you that question. Tell me a little bit about what's your latest research, Sasiporn?
Thank you for calling me. I appreciate that. Okay, the recent research that I have conducted is about writing parameter. We analyze how lexical density and sort of like syntactic complexity that in our students' academic paper, we use some application to analyze that.
Okay, so what's your paradigm, Sasiporn?
Um, Paradigm. I think it's about I'm not sure really because it's about number. We report only
Kenny, help Sasiporn out. What's her paradigm?
positivist,
Qualitative or quantitative?
What is it?
quantitative,
Is it
Quantitative.
qualitative?
quantitative.
Yeah, it's quantitative.
Yeah.
Did you ask any of the participants? Were they included?
Pardon me.
Were any of the participants included in the analysis or the coding of the data?
Not participant themselves. It's about their
No.
writing paper.
So you have produced knowledge from a quantitative paradigm. Yeah, you have made some findings. It's a priori, you had an idea, you set out to prove it or disprove it. When we get into qualitative, we need to think about, as I said to Kenny, tell me about your deepest fantasies. And Kenny said, no way. Yeah. So is it a worthy topic or am I just being nosy? Does it have rich rigor? So if we go back to Kenny's description of the forest, the second time it was much better because I knew it was muddy and there were insects flying around and there were bushes and you could hear the wild boar. So it had rich rigor. It was sincerity. There was a truthfulness, a credibility, and a resonance to it. And there was a coherence because Kenny was positioned and speaking out of his location of space and place. So we need to think about the connections in our decisions. Yeah, we need to think about the aspects of research. So Sasaporn's aspect of research, was it very connected or disconnected?
You asked
Disconnected.
me?
Yeah.
Yes. Disconnect.
Disconnected. So was there a theory or a concept that was to be tested or disproved? Sasaporn.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's a bit confirmed.
Yeah, so it was a priori. Was your research strategy structured or unstructured? Did you set off with a series of first I'll do this, then I will do this? So it was positivistic. Did it give you an objective reality? Did it produce results that you could say 9 out of 10 students did this?
Yes.
Yeah. So was your data reliable? If I went and reproduced your study, would I find the same data?
Probably yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what was your sample size? How many people was in your sample?
It's not quite large, but it's about like 2,000 words. It's from 17 papers.
Okay, that's still quite large. When I did my PhD, Sasaporn, guess how many people I did my PhD with?
I guess 20.
Bit lower?
A bit lower. 10, 12.
Bit lower?
5.
A bit lower?
No, 1.
I did it with 3.
Okay.
Yeah, and some people might say, well, there is no validity or reliability or generalizability in that. And I would say, no, there isn't, because it's not what I was interested in doing. I wasn't interested in producing generalizable, triangulated results. I was interested in rich, thick descriptions of individuals' experiences and stories of reading. I couldn't generalize that out. I did focus group interviews, and one focus group interview generated, let's go back to my telephone, 2 hours of talk. Do you know how long it took me to transpose 2 hours of talk? About 12 hours. 12 hours. So if I'd had 20 subjects, I would be drowning in data. And that brings us to something that we call data saturation. Yeah. If I'm going to interview Kenny, and if I'm going to interview Nuntia, and if I'm going to interview Sasaporn, I might get everything that I need to know from you 3. What is the point then of me interviewing another 50 people? Is it going to tell me anything new that you 3 have not already told me? So the notion of data saturation is really important, because it can stop a research project before it starts, because you drown in the data. Why isn't my thing working? Okay, so we've already spoken about positionality when I walk down the street, not looking like this, but being very visible as a gay man and reading the word as a gay man, because that's the lens that I chose to look at the world through. It's just one of the very many options that I have I can look through. So we come back to questions now about justifying. Can we justify the method of collecting data? How do we examine the arguments? What are the influences, the broader socio-cultural influences? So I used to teach in Vietnam, and I would ask questions of my students in Vietnam, and I would get the same answer from a class of 32 students, because the influence of the Ministry of Education in Vietnam was pervading. It set the policy, it set the curriculum, it set the pedagogy, it defined how they were going to teach, what they were going to teach. So everything went back to the influences. So when I was interested in their individual experiences, what was present was the policy. So the relationship between policy and pedagogy was not made explicitly, but they kept referencing the Ministry of Education. So the limitations as well depend upon the paradigm. It goes back to me saying, I'm not interested in doing generalizable, large-scale, quantitative studies. So for me, that's not a limitation. Because what happens a lot of the time, and this happens in examinations, and it examines when you write up your research and you publish your research in a peer-reviewed journal. And as an editor of a peer-reviewed journal, I get to read a lot of papers. Now, if a paper says I'm going to write about oranges, I expect the paper to be about oranges. I don't expect the paper to be about bananas. So if all of a sudden I read the paper and there's a banana, I'm thinking, well, there is a mismatch here between your methodology that you said you was going to use and the actual methodology that you was going to use. So let's move away from oranges and bananas and let's think about different types of methodologies. So if I'm saying I'm going to do participatory action research, what does that mean, Nantia?
So it means that we are not going in as a researcher, but we are going in as part of the research, you know. So we are co-creating anything that would be the part of that research. So,
and what does that involve? Can we just say, hey, I've got a great idea. I'm going to go to Campampet and hang out with a group of people and write about their lives. Is that how we do it?
No, it's because we look at them as our co-researchers. So they are part of us. They are co-creating everything that will involve in the issue. So not we are going to, to tell them or to ask them anything. Yeah.
So before we go up to Campampet, what do we have to do?
For me personally, we prepare ourselves. We reflect up on our positionality, our situation, and then we kind of build a relationship with them, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got in the car, you're driving up to Campampet, you've got to the village, you step out the village. Do you say, greetings, I'm Professor Nantia Dungpune from Mahidol University, Research Institute, Languages and Cultures of Asia. I'm here to research, blah, blah, blah. Or do you say, hi, I'm Nantia?
I just say, hi, I'm Nantia, and I will be there to uh, exchange idea or learning from them instead of me going there, telling them that have a great idea or want to change them in any way. No.
So here we then get back to this notion of truth, and that truth is co-constructed. And truth is co-constructed in relationships, by relationships, and through relationships. And that extends to the kind of methods that we use. So we might, when we're in Campan Pek in the village, we might engage in participant observation. Yeah, we're looking at what's happening around us. We might keep a reflexive journal. We might make observations and journal. That's another form of, and I don't like to use the word data, but I will use the word data collection. We might talk to people. Yeah, we might just have everyday conversations, or we might have interviews. Now, those interviews might be formal interviews or semi-structured interviews. Alternatively, we might have focus groups where we invite people to come together and discuss amongst themselves. The rule of thumb when doing interviews or when doing focus groups is what, Kenny? What's the rule of thumb? What should we be doing?
Can I help? I think for me, I'm just listening. That is the rule. And not really asking a question, just encourage the exchange of idea and discussions, and then listening.
Yeah, so we listen. Too many people, when they go to do interviews, talk too much. Well, you're not going to get the information that you want if you're talking too much, because you know what you already think. You need to develop and cultivate the skill of careful, congruent listening. And it's what Herder calls the intersubjective bridge. You need to build that bridge between you and your informant, you and the participant. Because without that, they're not going to, as Kenny said, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to tell you anything. So that relationship building is part of that methodological process of the trust building. And once you've got the trust, then you need to be quiet. You need to listen carefully, because remember, while you're listening, you're also engaged in analysis. The analysis in qualitative research is not something that comes at the end. The analysis is there from the beginning. You're making meaning in the interaction. And that's where you need to be thinking about the kinds of interpretations that you're making and how you can say that your interpretations were credible. So a little exercise for you now. So I've given you 4 research questions. I want you to match them to the possible data collection method. So just make a note. So you could say 1B, 3A, 4D, whatever. Just make a quick note of your responses to those research questions. And then give me a thumbs up when you're ready to move on. All right, it's not a test. I'm not gonna, if you get it wrong, it doesn't matter. Are you ready for the answers? Okay, let's check the answers. And what does that tell us? What does that tell us? Somebody new. Tuna. What does that tell us, Tuna?
I haven't defined this idea, but I haven't defined this idea. But focus group, I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, and focus group comes first.
Okay. What it tells us, if I'm going to go back. No, I can't go back. Yes, I can. So here we have the questions, yeah, that I asked you to match up. Here we have the answers. What the answers tell us is that there is more than one way of doing research. There are multiple ways of doing research. There are multiple methodologies and there are multiple methods that you can choose from. What is important is articulating for the reader why you have chosen that particular methodology and why you have chosen that method. There's a saying in England, which was the country of my birth, that there is more than one way to skin a cat. Not a very nice saying, since I have a little cat of my own. But you can come to a research project with multiple methodologies. Yeah, it's what you decide you want to use, and it goes back to the question of why are you using that particular methodology. And here we have, again, some decisions that will inform the why, you know, whether you want to be quantitative or whether you want to be qualitative. It talks about the relationship between the researcher and the researched, the concepts of the research, the strategy, yeah, the sample size. We already looked at that with Sasiporn's research, and your research was what, Sasiporn? What paradigm was it?
It's quantitative.
Yeah.
And yes, positivist. Yep.
Yeah. And your results would be generalizable. Would that be fair enough to say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a
You
bit
think so? You think so? Or you know so?
based on the data, people can have some implication and follow. I don't know. It might be, but I don't know.
Yes, and here we get into the messiness of research, because when people say they know, I always get a little bit suspicious of certainty, because research is about uncertainty. It's about becoming to know the unknown. And how we get to know the unknown, how we walk the path, depends on the kind of shoes we're wearing, doesn't it, Kenny? Let's go back to you in the jungle. Yeah? Okay. So Kenny is walking along a muddy path in the jungle, but he's walking in a pair of high-heeled stiletto shoes.
Why should I wear those in the first place?
Why shouldn't you wear them? That goes back to your positionality. You might like wearing high-heeled shoes. How easy would it be for Kenny walking through the muddy jungle in a pair of high-heeled shoes? Kenny?
It would be very pathetic.
There's nothing that I love wearing high-heeled shoes. There's nothing pathetic about high-heeled shoes.
In the muddy forest.
What would be easier for you to walk through a muddy forest in?
Boots.
Boots. Yeah, boots. So it goes back to if we use the wrong, and there's no such thing as right or wrong, but if we use a methodology that doesn't suit the focus of the object, what's going to happen, Kenny?
I wouldn't go anywhere.
You won't go anywhere because you're going to be stuck in the mud in your high heel shoes.
And maybe you hurt yourself. You
And
haven't.
maybe I don't think you'd hurt yourself because we're not actually in a forest with high heel shoes, but you're not using the right tools or approaches to get the best answer. One doesn't wear high heel shoes to walk through a muddy forest. Does one, Kenny?
No.
Where do you wear your high heel shoes, Kenny?
Where?
Yeah.
Maybe in a pub in England along London Street.
Okay.
And
so maybe next time you see Kenny wearing his high heel shoes, it would be in a pub.
I would wear those in Thailand.
Why not?
I would wear them in Melbourne when
Why not? Why would you
you
wear them in Thailand?
Because it's out of the context of the cultural.
No, it's not.
Cultural.
No, it's not. I have lots of ladyboy friends who love wearing high heel shoes. Maybe it's out of your context, yeah? So if we think of your context, what is your context then if you wouldn't wear high heel shoes?
Well, it should be the place where the the surrounding actually accepts that.
Does it? But I would argue that Thailand does accept men wearing high heel shoes. There is a culture in Thailand because it's never been...
I don't mind. I will not look at you.
Because Thailand has never been colonized by a Judeo-Christian country that has instructed very strict divisions between genders and binaries. So when I lived in Thailand, I lived next door to 3 very beautiful young ladyboys who always wore high heel shoes. That was fine. But not for you, Kenny, because you are governed by the rules of heterogendered patriarchy, and that's the silent discourse. You would feel uncomfortable in wearing a pair of sparkly high heel shoes down the street because you'd be concerned what people might be thinking and what they would be looking at you and the assumptions that they might make around who you are in Thailand. So here we have all that hidden stuff that I was talking about again. Yeah. I'm very aware of the time, so I'm not going to talk about sampling too much, but interviewing allows us for depth and complexity. It allows us to cover a wide range of topics. It's quite socially acceptable because we talk, we're communicative creatures. And like I said, I'm incredibly nosy. So when I meet somebody for the first time, they get a barrage of questions because it's like, who are you? Where are you from? What do you like? What do you do? Have you got a partner? Is your partner male or female? How long have you been together? And they often run away screaming, saying, who is this crazy person asking me all these questions? But we then go back to the paradigms. So a qualitative approach is often inductive. Yeah, it starts with a small observation. I've observed Kenny walking down the street in a pair of silver high heel shoes, and it sparked my curiosity as to why. So I want to go and find out more. A deductive approach, if we go to Sasiporn's research, starts from a generalized principle, which we're seeking to either prove or disprove. It's that a priori, yeah? So we always need to be thinking about our justification. Are we doing the research for valid reasons? Is the kind of data that we're collecting appropriate or not appropriate? What about our analysis? Where does our analysis come depending upon the paradigm? And is it trustworthy and is it reliable? So here we have different types of knowledge that are aligned with those paradigms. And the aim and the characteristics and the sample and data collection. And so we have a divide, we have a dichotomy between the different approaches that we can apply and put into the research conversation. So from where we start will determine how we finish. So can you justify your positionality? Can you justify your sample? So I would say, you know, do we really need 3,000 people interviewing or questionnaire on 3,000 people? Maybe 500 would give us the same results, because we get to that notion of data saturation. And then we get into methods, which I've talked about, and then we get into the analysis. So much of my work is conceptual, yeah? And what I mean by conceptual is that where's my lens? I pick up my lens and I look through the world with a particular lens. And my lenses tend to be queer theory, or gender theory, or critical theory, or critical race theory. But I have a lens that I choose to look at the world through. And depending on which lens I use, which concept, I will find different things. A few years ago, there was no such thing as whiteness. Whiteness just was, you were just white. It was only with the development of critical race theory that constructed whiteness as a category of privilege that we came to be able to understand and interrogate the kind of power that being white gives you. The same with the feminists in the 1970s, who started to think about patriarchy and masculinity as privilege. We think about disability scholars who came up with the construct and concept of ableness and how being ably-bodied gives you privilege. Queer theory came up with the concept of heteronormativity, that being heterosexual was the only valid and legitimate form of sexual expression. So depending upon the conceptual tools and the theoretical tools, we can look at the same phenomena, but our analysis can produce different results. So you need to explain, in terms of your methodology, why you have taken that approach, why those conceptual tools, be it queer theory or feminist theory or critical race theory or disability theory, informs your analysis and is connected back to your choice of methodology, because the choice of methodology has got implications, whether we want rich, thick descriptions of Kenny walking in his stilettos through the jungle muddy, or whether we want generalizable results as Sasiporn's research did. So you need to provide that rich, thick description of how your data is going to be gathered and analyzed. I need to know that if you're using a feminist lens, or whether you're using a critical pedagogy lens, or whether you're using a participatory community approach lens, or whether you're using a post-human lens. And I will come on to post-humanism in a little while, because Nuntia asked me to explain that, okay? But you need to show a critical and reflective sense. You can't say, well, I just did it. That won't wash. Well, I just did it. We want to know the how. So the methodology is what I call, it's the engine of your research. It's how you have done it. It's not the what, it's not a why. So, for example, I'm going to ask Tuna to answer me this question. You're walking down the street, Tuna, and there's a hole, and you fall in the hole. What do you think?
Maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay. You're thinking of a why. You're thinking, why did I fall in the hole?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's what I will say.
I would be thinking, how do I get out the hole?
Okay.
Not why am I in the hole? How do I get out of it?
Okay, point taken.
And that's the difference in methodology. Methodology is the how. How am I doing this? How am I producing knowledge? Because to ask a why question might be unanswerable. Why? Why is Kenny wearing stilettos in a London pub? We may never know the answer. So some things just won't go any further. So when we think of methodology, we think of the how, not the why. Not why am I in a hole? How am I going to get out of this hole? What tools are going to help me? What tools might help me get out of my hole, Tuna? What tools?
Maybe a ladder.
A
No.
ladder. So
Yeah.
the ladder, thinking about it in terms of methodology.
Or I can short.
I'm
help
very
me.
little.
Yeah.
No, I'm very
people.
little.
So what I need would be a ladder.
So the ladder is the data. The data is the tool. Recently, I was in Vancouver, and I've never been to Vancouver Island before. And so I kept thinking it was going to be wild, and it was going to be full of bears and cougars and lions and things that were going to eat me. So I went and bought myself a rape alarm, because I did a lot of research on what to do if you meet a bear. And the first thing the internet said, or Google said, was make yourself big. I thought, well, I'm stuffed, because I'm not big, I'm little. Even if I put my arms up, I'm still not big. So making myself big was not an option. So the next thing was make a loud sound. And I thought, okay, how loud is my voice? Not very. So I thought, I'll go and buy myself a rape alarm. So if I'm walking down the street and I meet a bear, I'm going to be protected. Actually, when I got to Vancouver Island, it was like a city and there were no bears or lions or tigers or anything to be found. So I wasted my money on the rape alarm, but I've still got it just in case I do meet a bear, perchance. So I'm going to move on because we've talked about that. So how to? So really that's a question for you now. Who are you going to research? What are you going to research? When are you going to research it? How are you going to research it? Why are you going to research it? So what? So what? If you're just curious about research, don't do it. Yeah, not if it involves other people. Because if you wouldn't want questions to be asked of you, why do you think it's okay to ask those questions of other people? Yeah. And so what? If you wouldn't want family members or loved ones or dear ones to be involved in a project that is potentially harmful, then why are you designing a project that might be potentially harmful? And then we get into the whole realm of ethics. So my kind of last slide, I don't know where my last slide has gone, but it wasn't that one. The idea is, on my last slide that I wanted to show you, is that methodology is a blank page. You start with a blank page. What you bring to methodology is the complexity of how knowledge is produced. Yeah, and so an easy way to think about it maybe is thinking about, how could I describe methodology and methods to a 7-year-old in a way that they would understand? And I always think, well, if I had to explain methodology and methods to a 7-year-old, I would say to them, methodology is the soup. It's the liquid. Method are the carrots, the onions, whatever you put into it. Yeah, they're the things that get you out of the hole, to go back to tuna, or they're the things that you can see that are visible. Methodology is much more conceptual and theoretical. Now, the last time that I gave this talk, I referenced post-qualitative research and post-humanism research. And what did you say, Nantia?
I said, yeah, I don't think I don't understand what it is, and I don't think many people would know the concept of post-humanism.
Yeah.
Because the concept of humanism is difficult enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So would you explain a little bit more? Yeah.
So when we think about post-humanist research, yeah, we're thinking about the relationship, the ontological epistemic relationship, the knowledge between self, or the relationship between self and knowledge, the relationship between self and other. Yeah? Are you all familiar with the concept of the other? Nantia, can you explain the concept of the other, please?
Can you ask me again? Sorry.
Yeah, what's the concept of the other? So the concept of othering.
Yeah, this is where we separate people from, is this us and them? Is this
Yeah, us and them. So we create a binary between us and them.
Yeah.
When we kind of get into the human, let's not forget, is always imbricated in data. It's imbricated in that relational space of representation and restoring. And it always involves a nomenclature. And that nomenclature usually is invisible. And that invisibility makes it normal. So as academics, as researchers, we talk about data. But where has data come from? Let's not forget that in order to seek legitimacy, we borrowed the word data from positivistic scientific research. Because if I said to Tuna, well, I just look at everyday life and I'd look at stuff, does that sound like I'm doing research, or does it just sound like I'm walking down the street?
No, I hate to answer this question.
But if I use the word data, what does it make me sound like, Kenny?
Like scientist.
Makes me sound like a scientist. It gives me legitimacy. It means that the lens that I am looking at you through is a legitimate lens because it separates me. It separates me as belonging to the academy. And if I'm part of the academy and if I'm a researcher, then I have status and I have a PhD. And a PhD means that I have acquired a certain level of knowledge and skills that sets me apart from everyday people. Would that be a fair thing to say? Yeah. So thinking about the individual and thinking about the systemic as a practice space, my knowledge as someone with a PhD who belongs to a university in post-qualitative research is no more special than my neighbor who maybe is a bricklayer who walks down the street. Why am I giving myself a specific set of names or using names to justify and legitimize what I'm doing? Because it's part of what I call the global North colonial world imagery approach. Yeah, it goes back to the Descartesian dualism between mind and body. Last year, I spent some time in Fiji. And while I was in Fiji, we had what they called a talanoia. And a talanoia is a speaking circle. And when there is an issue to be addressed, then the community forms a speaking circle, and that's their methodology to which to produce and resolve new knowledge. Now, that's a global South methodology. It's an indigenous methodology. It may not be recognized by the global North as being valid or scientific or having rigor, but that's because the global North has colonized the production of knowledge and how knowledge is made. And you only have to think about the Thai context in terms of thinking about the ways that indigenous knowledges are valued or not valued within the Thai academy. Yeah, this notion of being in a peer-reviewed Q1 journal that you have to demonstrate X, Y, and Z. I would ask the question, why? So I would say that the method and methodology has been authorized by the global North. And within the post-foundational or the post-qualitative moment, we need to think differently. So we need to think as knowing as embodiment, knowing through our body, the hunger, the tastes, the discomforts, the pains, the pleasures, the sensory. We need to think about knowing as emotion, opening ourselves up to our worlds of our passions, our intuitions, our fears and betrayals. We need to think about knowing through deliberate imposition, about thinking with our ideas about the world that are slippery and indistinct. And here we get into the notion of the Anthropocene and thinking with the more than human, thinking with the environment. And that's so important now in terms of when you look what's happened with Morocco, when you look what's happening with global rising, when you think about the melting of the ice caps, we're not separate from our environment. We're not, you know, we have been because we've acted upon the environment and it's created a climate crisis. So now we need to be thinking with the environment, with trees, with ice, with water, and give those things as much agency as we give the human. So we need to decenter the human. We need to step back and say, well, we're actually not that important in the greater scheme of things. The trees and the ice caps and the oceans have agency, because if we don't do something, San Francisco and Bangkok and London won't exist in 80 years' time. They'll be underwater. Species are dying out. So we think with the more than human. We think about the deliberate imposition that sees ourselves as being decentered, as being slippery, as being in relation to. And then we think about knowledge and methodology as situated inquiry. How far is our knowledge able to travel? So if Kenny does a project in Korat, how far will that knowledge travel, dependent upon the kind of methodologies and methods that he uses? Will it be recognized as valid and acceptable in the global north, which has a particular colonial and Cartesian approach to thinking about what knowledge is? Should we not be listening more to the global south? Should we not be listening more to indigenous knowledges, indigenous ways of being and doing that have been protecting the earth for thousands of years before we started to, and I would swear here, but I realized I'm being recorded, so I won't. So that's when we kind of get into a kind of a post-qualitative, a post-human approach, because we start to think with affect, we start to think with feeling, and we start to think about how our research and how our methodologies can disconnect, can excite, divert, inspire, distract, startle, surprise, reorient, interrupt our thinking, and enable us to think without teleology, without a beginning and a middle and an end. Because the global north talks about knowledge as being arborescent. And arborescent is tree-like. So there's the top of the tree, there's the middle of the tree, and there's the bottom of the tree. It has teleology. You start at the bottom, you work to the middle, you get to the top. A much more post-human approach thinks about the rhizome and how knowledge is rhizomatic. So we think about all those little tubulars that are underneath the earth that we can't see, that we are connected. It's horizontal, it's linear, it's messy, it's uncertain, it's in constant need of re-articulation, of representation, of re-storying. We're not working with taken for granted assumptions. We're always in the middle, starting afresh, starting anew, and we're thinking with our location. We're thinking with who we are in the world. We're thinking with where we are in the world, because all of those things are part of the methodology of coming to re-know ourselves in the world, because the world is constantly in the process of remaking itself. We are in the constant process of remaking ourselves and reconstituting ourselves as subjects. And in order to be able to narrate that story, in order to be able to tell that story convincingly and powerfully and purposefully, we need to have a knowledge of the tools by which we're doing it. And those tools are aligned with the methodology and the paradigm and the methods. We need the ladder. If we don't have the ladder, what happens, Tuna?
What happens? We wouldn't be able to get out of the hole.
We're stuck
You
in
will
the
be able to come out. Yes, come out of the hole.
We're stuck in the
You
hole.
will get stuck in it. Yeah,
And if we're stuck in the hole, what can we see?
nothing.
Exactly, thank you. And on that note, I'm going to stop talking because I've realized I've gone over time and some people might have questions that they want to ask, which I'm more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for this insightful talk and thought-provoking discussion. So any questions from the floor, from our online audience? Any questions?
There's got to be some.
Yeah.
Did it make sense?
Let's get our PhD students to ask. Dan, any question? Dan Gao, are you still there? PhD students, come on.
Yeah, come on, PhD students.
Yeah. Or wanna be PhD, anybody?
Is Quang there still? Let's pick
Yeah,
on
Guang's still there.
Quang. Quang, are you there? I can't see you. Quang, you're there.
Oh, Marita, you switch on the camera. Are you ready to ask?
No, it is not a question, Professor. It is just a request if there can be another talk about the post-humanism something. It was mentioned a while back during the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think this discussion to me is very clearly discussed by Mark. But I am also interested in knowing more about the post-humanism. Is that a theory, a framework?
It's a theoretical framework and a conceptual understanding in a way of looking at the world. So what I would suggest is, you see, if I was in Thailand now, where I should be, I could have done another session, but maybe Nantia and Kenny can organize something, another session which will be focused purely on post-humanism and post-foundational research.
Yeah. Yes, I will be looking forward to it, Professor Kenny.
Yeah.
Quang, turn yourself on. I can't see you, my dear. Stop hiding in the corners. Where are you? Quang. You're not
Question
even there.
from Prof. Nantidaครับ Prof. Nantida.
I can't hear anything.
Natida, you have to switch on the mic.
Oh.
You haven't switched
Yes,
yet.
sorry. Good evening, Professor.
Oh dear, are you poorly? Are you sick?
I think post-humanity is thought often challenges conversation in academic time and impact for human identity, ethics, and sociality. And I want to know, do you think about the idea or theory is impact research design or not?
I think it's very impactful. In fact, I'm just going to just bear with me 1 minute. I'm going to show you a book. Where's my book? Okay. I would urge you, all of you, if you're interested in theory, to have a look at this book. Can you see it? It's called Thinking. Can you see it? Can everyone see it? No. Thinking with Theory in Qualitative Research. And it's by Alicia Jackson and Lisa Mazzai. I don't know how to do this. And what Jackson and Mazzai talk about, and also Elizabeth St. Pierre talks about in her paper, The Refusal of Method, is that we need to find a new vocabulary. We need to find a new imagery. We need to find a new nomenclature to describe the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at you now, yeah, and you are signifying to me something which I wouldn't have thought about 5 years ago, because you're wearing a mask. And that mask to me says COVID. We didn't even know about COVID 5 years ago. So we're all living in a post-COVID world, which has created a new way of living, a new way of being, especially for those of us that were in lockdown. It's created a new language. It's created a counter discourse in terms of conspiracy theories and truth and what is not truth. None of that existed 5 years ago till COVID came along. So COVID is an example of thinking with the more than human. It's thinking with the virus. It's thinking, what has the virus done to change and transform our lives? It's got us thinking about the next virus that is going to come along, which we have been told will by the scientists. And we have been told that these viruses come from the cutting down of trees in the Amazon jungle, which contained these viruses. And with the deforestation, these viruses are now being released into the global stratosphere, and they are traveling. So that's an example of how we have to think with our environment, because if we don't, the environment won't become extinct, we will. And we're already on that path. So the idea that the environment or land or place or space has as much agency as the human is central to the idea of post-humanism. Because when we kind of go back and think about Descartes and the Descartesian split between mind and body in humanism, the human became the central object of study. The human became the agent of change that drove the Industrial Revolution, that colonized and went out into other countries, mainly the global south, and eradicated their histories and their cultures and their languages. Thankfully, Thailand was not one of them. Thailand managed to escape. But you look at Vietnam, you look at all the countries around Thailand that were colonized by countries from the global north that imposed their language and their customs and their traditions and their ways of seeing. Now we're in a situation where it's not the people from the global north, but it's the impacts of the global north from the Industrial Revolution and technology and the burden of fossil fuels that is impacting islands of Fiji, because the ice caps are melting, which are raising the sea levels, and whole communities are having to move island because their island is being taken over by the sea. And the predictions that if we don't do something about this, and the whole of the west coast of America will disappear. San Francisco, LA will not exist. Bangkok will not exist. It will be underwater. And and then we have the human diaspora. We've already got people fleeing now from earthquakes, from climate change. Parts of the world are going to become inhabitable, either too cold or too wet or too hot, which means that countries are going to become borderless. And so it's no good saying to people, sorry, you can't come into our country. the global flow of human traffic will triple, it will increase as the world changes, as the environment changes. So we need to give agency to that which is not human. We need to think with the forests. We need to think with the ice caps. We need to think with the oceans. Does that make sense? Instead of thinking about them and from them and doing things to them, we need to listen and hear the roar of the ocean when it says, no more pollution, please. We need to listen to the roar and the angry voice of the earthquakes when it says, no more fracking, no more drilling for oil, please. We need to listen and with the whales when they say, please don't do deep sea mining because it makes us deaf with all your bombing. And it interrupts the kind of the sonar system of communication for dolphins and other such mammals. We need to kind of take a step back and stop thinking about ourselves as being the center of everything, because we are not. Yeah, there's agency. Agency lies with the more than human, especially as we're moving from the Anthropocene moment into the post-Anthropocene moment. But the global north would say, oh, what tosh. Let's just go and measure something and analyze it and then say there's results. I'm afraid that doesn't work anymore. For me, it doesn't work anymore. But I'm a critical queer methodologist, so people would disagree with me. But, as long as I'm saying this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm doing it, I'm being honest. I'm not saying I'm a banana when really I'm an orange. I'm saying I'm an orange and you're going to get an orange. And if you don't like it, tough. Let's have the debate. Let's have the discussion. Let's have the argument about collecting the pebble on the beach, whether that's a valid and useful methodological approach in late modernity, in the Anthropocene. What does collecting the pebble on the beach tell us? Maybe we should be thinking with the pebble. What is the history of the pebble? Where has the pebble come from? What can the pebble tell us? And now you're all thinking I'm crazy.
I think that's really, give us something to think about, and it's kind of reflect your positionality into the way you look at the world now. So it's just, as you say, open for debates. That should be good.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
Methodology is not static. The world is changing, and so must the methodologies that we use to investigate the social. If you went into a hospital and it looked like a hospital from 100 years ago, then you would turn around and walk out very quickly because you would think, hang on a minute, this is out of date. The same can be applied to any understanding of methodologies. Methodologies are constantly shifting and moving and emerging because the world is. And I will forever in my mind, from now on, have the image of Kenny in stilettos stuck in mud in the jungle.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Are there any more questions for Mark. Actually, tomorrow, Mark will also give a talk about LGBTQ plus methodology as well. So for those who are interested in queer theory, in the critical lens of the research, you are more than welcome. And also will be a webinar as well. Yeah. And I think, today, I think our discussion is not only just about research itself, it's about reflecting on yourself as researcher or as a, wannabe researcher or PhD. That's the methodologies and methods, have to deal with your positionalities as well.
I always
But-
say to my PhD students, when they come into me at the beginning of the process, the first thing that I say to them, I said, is at the end of this process, you will not be the same person. You will not look at the world with the same eyes. You will be transformed by doing the work. And if you haven't been transformed, then you haven't done it rightly.
And actually, a question from PhD student, she asked the differences between paradigm and approach.
Okay, so a paradigm, okay, I would use the word approach. A paradigm defines quantitative and qualitative. Yeah, the two main paradigms that we think about how knowledge gets constructed. An approach kind of fits within that paradigm. So my approach within a qualitative paradigm is narrative. I tell stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right then. So I think we go beyond time, but again, I mean, all the discussion has been very fruitful and informative I'm sure for everybody. And tomorrow again, at 10 o'clock with the LGBTQ. I think tomorrow will be more fun because this is the area where Mark is so much interested in, and I'm sure that I will pick on again tomorrow.